I have to confess that I've been stressing out for months now about what to tell you tonight, the story to tell you. I was thinking that maybe I would, I was going to mention the thing about how I traumatized my parents by getting into an Ivy League law school and not going. That was after also not going to medical school, so they were double traumatized. I also thought about telling you some stories about growing up in suburban Ohio, where I was one of maybe 6 students of color in my graduating class of more than 500. For most of those years, I was also the only Asian girl, and I got teased quite a lot, mostly for my size and occasionally for my, shall we call it, underdeveloped figure. The boys in middle school would call me Chesty for Chesty Morgan, who was a very well-endowed stripper whose picture appeared in the local newspaper ads. One day they were doing this in orchestra, and I remember my orchestra director, because of course I played violin, Mr. Holoshovsky, who was about the most exotic thing in my town. He was from Czechoslovakia. Anyway, he peered down over the music stands at me, and instead of scolding the boys, he said, "Don't worry, dear, they'll grow." Even my calculus teacher used to tease me about my size. He did this impression of me driving. It was like this. My sisters told me, my younger sisters, who are also here tonight, told me that 4 years later, he was still doing this impression of me for his classes. Anyway, but I decided actually that instead of telling you more about that, I would do the Asian cliche thing tonight and tell you about my parents. But actually about my mom, because like a lot of Korean men, my dad gets plenty of attention. When I was 6, I remember being at some sort of church gathering in someone's home, and the kids, we were playing in the backyard. And I noticed my mother standing on the patio giving a talk to some of the other adults. So I inched over because I was curious, and I hid behind a plant because obviously I wasn't supposed to be there. And I heard her telling the story of how she and her mother and her sister escaped on foot from North Korea. I don't think I even knew at that point that she was from North Korea. So when we went home, I asked her why she had never told us this story. And she said that she hadn't wanted us to be scared. And because she said that, I thought that maybe it scared her to talk about it. And so I didn't ask her any more details. So the other reason I'm very grateful to Korean American Story is because at the end of last year, HJ and Janice videotaped each of my parents telling their stories for the Legacy Project, while my sisters and I listened and learned so many things that we never knew. One of my mother's earliest stories is about her father in the time of the Japanese occupation. One day, he didn't come home from a visit to the family's textile factory. My grandmother, wondering what had happened and getting no information, sneaked out of his family's home where she lived and went to the factory. And when she got there, outside the office, she saw 3 pairs of shoes: her mother-in-law's, her father-in-law's, and her husband's. Because she wasn't supposed to be there, she couldn't even knock or go in the office where her husband lay dying from a factory accident. She put her ear against the door and heard his last words: "What will become of my daughters?" My mother tells how she and her sister slept on either side of their mother every night, holding her hands while tears streamed down her face. One day, The maid found a bundle in the corner of their bedroom. It contained scissors and knives and other sharp objects, which my mother and her sister had hidden for fear that their mother would kill herself from grief. She tells how my mother refused the entreaties of the local matchmakers to marry again because she would have had to leave her daughters behind. My mother tells of the escape from North Korea when she was 12, of being allowed to bring only a single knapsack, of following the guides, walking all night in the rainy season, of hiding under haystacks during the daytime. She tells how on the third night her sister slipped and fell and broke her arm, but couldn't even cry out for fear of being caught. She recalls how 70 years later, when she broke her first bone and felt the excruciating pain, she thought immediately back to that night and how much agony her sister must have been walking in silence with the broken limb until they were safe on the other side. She talks about how once they resettled in Seoul, my grandmother took in their male cousins and various male orphans and hid them in closets from North Koreans who wanted to conscript them. The young men decided they were endangering the women, so they left to hide in the forest. The women and the men would exchange news by putting notes under a rock until one day there was no message from the men. They had been caught. My mother and her mother went to the prison and they saw my cousin in the window of the North Koreans' jail. He was the only one who hadn't managed to escape, and he was taken to North Korea, and they never saw him again. She tells of leaving everything behind a second time, and it wouldn't be the last. Leaving Seoul as the bombs fell, on top of a cargo train, headed to Busan, lying under heavy blankets against the snow and the rain. She recalls watching a young child die and the mother refusing to get back on the train so that she could stay where her son would be buried. Life continued like this, loss and hardship and more loss and hardship, with my grandmother always finding a way for the family to survive. My mother remembers that on her first day at Ewha College, the president asked them to write down their goals, and while her classmates scribbled furiously, she wrote only 4 Chinese characters on her paper. Smart mother, good wife. This was all she wanted, for security and stability and to be happy. My mom almost didn't make it here tonight. 4 weeks ago, she had a heart attack while my father watched as the medics rushed in to revive her. We were very lucky. The doctors say she is fine. And still, as you can understand, my dad did not want her to get on a plane from California to come here tonight. But my mother hates missing anything. And after all that she and so many other Koreans of her generation have been through, there is little that is daunting. You know, every day when I went to school, it was my father who said, study hard. But when I walked out the door every day, my mother said, be nice. So my personal version of hell, or a vision of hell, is sitting in a room trapped while everyone from my past comes in and tells me every not nice thing I've ever done or said or even thought. And unfortunately, there are more of those than there should be. It's because of my mom that I try to do better. In the years since my grandmother died peacefully in her sleep, my mother has talked often of how clever she was and generous and wise, and how she wishes she could tell her one more time how grateful she is. So, Mom, I hope you know how grateful I am for everything you've done. Thank you. And thank you, Korean American Story, for giving me and my family the gift of our parents' stories and the stories of our community. Thank you.